All right. Sorry about Friday's snafu, posting the wrong link for you. I hope I didn't throw you off too badly. We're continuing on with the French Revolution this week and really actually getting into a more liberal aspect of it, time period of it. It gets pretty bloody going forward, honestly. It gets pretty out of control. And we're going to introduce some of those characters today that made it get so out of control. And then the last phase, which we'll probably be tackling mostly next week, is when Napoleon comes along. But a couple of reminders to get us right back to where we were. We had this sort of old style government with the king having absolute power and the nobles and the clergy having all this privilege. The king tried to raise taxes. The Third Estate said, we're not having that. We're going to write a constitution. The king started to resist, and the people in Paris tore down the Bastille. But that didn't change much. The king was still just hiding out in Versailles. So the women went out to Versailles, sort of dragged the king and his family from their beds and back to Paris, and they brought with them some flour, a lot of flour, to feed the poor in Paris, and their hopes was that would be sort of a peace offering. But things are going to start to get worse. The old regime here is going to crumble. One of the first things that we see start to crumble is the way the church had privilege. Remember, there had been this government style of the Estates General, and that got sort of abolished, and this National Convention took its place. And one of the things the National Convention decided to do was reform the system by which the church had so much privilege. So they did several things. One of the things they did is they actually seized church property, and they sold it. Now, a lot of what's going to happen here is going to be basically kind of offensive to us as Christians. For instance, they're going to end up sort of desecrating the Notre Dame Cathedral. They're going to sort of refit it to be a cathedral to reason rather than to God. And so they're going to take church property and they're going to sell it. Not all of that was like actually church buildings, but they're going to use that money to to finance new government programs. They're also going to actually make it so that the church is actually under the power of the government. For instance, bishops and priests are going to be elected by people, which is not actually new. Before in church history that was happening, and it could be a good move, actually. We certainly recognize that there had been corruption in the church from time to time, and times where people became bishops without really being qualified or even caring about their post. People became priests without necessarily caring directly for the things of God. So maybe the elections could be a good thing, but we do see the church being reformed quite heavily. As pressure began to build, the king and his family started to realize they were maybe in some danger. Well, it turns out they really were in danger, but they actually attempted to flee. They went in disguise, and they were headed to get out of France, and they made it all the way to a town called Varennes, which is actually pretty close to the border. They almost made it out, but they were recognized when they got there, and they were recaptured. And that moment really is kind of the last hope for the king. It's going to start to go downhill pretty quickly. Another thing that happens that actually amps up the intensity of the revolution is other countries start to want to intervene. Austria is very highly motivated to intervene because Austria is the home place or the home country of Marie Antoinette, the queen. And so Austria is going to start to sort of mobilize on her behalf, and other kingdoms and other countries are thinking of doing the same. And the French sort of took this as a matter of pride, and so what they did was they actually declared war on Austria, and this started off pretty badly for France. It wasn't going well. And this led to more food shortages, this led to more intensity and sort of a quarrelsome population of people in Paris. And what they ended up doing was actually sort of attacking the king and his family, not directly, but attacking the palace. And the king was taken captive. And the people began to call for more radical changes. In particular, the city government of Paris became very, very radical, very, very liberal. And they were called the sans-culottes. This is a word that means without fancy pants, basically. Culottes were a type of pants that only the nobles wore. So the people who were trying to identify with the poor called themselves sans-culottes, without sans. They were calling for more radical changes, and they want to move towards a republic because actually the first constitution that they wrote during the French Revolution was still a monarchy. So there's going to be these leaders who are going to push the conversation towards being more radical. The first is Georges Danton, who's going to be the Minister of Justice under the National Convention, and he is actually going to be one of the people pushing for these attacks on the king and his family. And then there's this journalist, Jean-Paul Marat. He's actually very famous for a few reasons. One is his writing. He's radical and liberal, and he's pushing the envelope of the French Revolution. Two, he had this health condition that was pretty uncomfortable, so he actually most of the time worked in a bathtub. He would just soak in a bath. And when he did that, when he soaked in this bath, he would write and write and write. And eventually, a woman came to have audience with him and got an appointment with him, and she actually murders him in the bath. There's a very, very famous painting of him laying dead in the bathtub. This story just has so many intense layers to it. Anyway, these two are pushing for more liberal and radical changes, and a lot of times on behalf of the poor. And so what ends up happening is the National Convention in September calls for the abolishment of the monarchy, to get rid of the king altogether. And they want to establish a republic. Now, in the National Convention, there was this divide between those who were more intense and those who were less intense. The first group is the Girondins, and the counterpart is the Jacobins. Girondins tended to be a little less radical, and the Jacobins were more radical. Girondins had a lot of influence outside of Paris, and the Jacobins had a lot of influence inside of Paris. And the Jacobins had this group of politicians they called the Mountain within the National Convention, and they actually eventually convince the National Convention to call for the death of Louis XVI, who actually is then beheaded by guillotine on January 21st, 1793. This is actually an instrument of execution that was sort of invented parallel to the French Revolution, and they thought it was very, very humane, a quick and clean and easy death. And I guess that's true, but it's still death. And they took the life of the king on January 21st, 1793. By all accounts, people who were there, the priests who presided over the moment, he was very, very brave and actually pronounced forgiveness over the crowd and over the people who were doing this to him. King Louis XVI is not perfect, but that moment is, I think, rather remarkable. But getting rid of the king actually didn't solve the problems for the Republic. They couldn't really agree on anything. They had this Girondins versus Jacobins conversation really throughout, and they had a really hard time. They had a really hard time passing a new constitution that was really cohesive, and they had a hard time controlling the countryside. People in the countryside were not nearly as radical as the Mountain and the Jacobins wanted, and not as radical as the crowds of Paris were. And then the last trouble for the revolution that came along was all-out war. The kingdoms around France were not really, they didn't like this idea that you could just kill the king if you didn't like the king. Obviously, that would put them in danger too. So countries like Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Britain, the Dutch, all decided to begin to intervene in the chaos that the French Revolution had become. So there was war. And this obviously was more pressure on this new fledgling government in France. So what they did is they created what they called the Committee of Public Safety. And this Committee of Public Safety was supposed to be, dedicated to keeping the public safe. But it became a bloodbath. These two leaders, Georges Danton, remember he had been the Minister of Justice, and a new name, Maximilien Robespierre, led the Committee of Public Safety, and what they ended up doing was presiding over the deaths of really thousands and thousands of people, mostly nobles, but anybody they thought would be a threat to the revolution, anybody they thought were enemies of the revolution, were in danger of being put to death. That's one of the things that the other countries were doing. They were trying to help these noble families and people who were in danger escape. There's a man named the Scarlet Pimpernel, or that's what he called himself, who was notorious for helping these nobles escape to safer places like England, because the reign of Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre is really, as we're going to see, a reign of terror. There's going to be tens of thousands of people killed by the government of France in the name of liberty. And you can see how much sense that makes. Calling it liberty, calling it in the name of justice and liberty, but doing it through injustice and doing it through murderous policies. So the French Revolution, by the time we get to 1793, is really starting to come unhinged. We'll talk more about it tomorrow.